Here's everything you'll need to build the simplest router sled imaginable. 2 angle iron pieces, your router base, some threaded inserts, dust collection port, some paste, 8 bolts to secure everything together, and some scrap 3/4 inch plywood. Let's get to it.
Making things flat in woodworking is extremely important, especially when you're making tabletops. And if you're in a small shop like me, probably the best way, easiest way to do that is with a router sled. It's this tool that lets a router with a surfacing bit go back and forth over a rough surface and makes it completely flat. And today we're going to be building a very simple version of this that I can store in my shop without having it take up a lot of space. So the very first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take this scrap piece of plywood and cut it down to about 7.5 inches by about 20 inches. This will be enough plywood to create the end caps for the router that kind of hold it together, as well as the shuttle that the actual router will sit on. The angle iron that I'm using for the structure of the router sled has an inside corner that's rounded. And if I were just to put the plywood directly inside of it, it wouldn't sit quite flat and everything would be kind of wonky as a result. So to counter this, I'm going to cut a 45-degree bevel on the plywood, so it will sit flush within the angle iron. Okay, here I am sanding by hand. I didn't want to use my Festool sander on this because it would have blown through the veneer on this super quick and just completely ruined it. Although, you know, not that big of a deal because it's a router sled, it's not fine furniture, but I didn't want to ruin the veneer. I'm gonna have to invest in probably an edge sander at some point, or like a belt sander or an oscillating sander. I see mixed reviews on them on YouTube, so I'm kind of like on the fence about it. So I'm doing this on both sides. I'm taking those end caps that we cut previously, and I'm just gonna lay them out where I want them to go on the angle iron, and then I'm gonna clamp them together. You probably noticed that there's actually already holes in my angle iron because I actually built this before, and I didn't really like that build, so I decided to rebuild it using a little bit different style. And those holes were just from the previous build. But I'm taking all the learnings that I got from that build and I'm building it correctly this time and sharing everything with you. So in the end, I'm just gonna bolt everything together with these 5/16 bolts. And I gotta drill the holes the same width, so I'm using a 5/16 drill bit. This stuff just goes straight through the mild steel, no problem, and right to the plywood. So I just drill it all at once with everything clamped down together. And I don't want these metal shavings to go all over my shop, so I'm trying to suck them up as best I can with my vacuum. Kind of doesn't work, kind of works. It's better than nothing. And now with those holes drilled, I'll just slide the bolts through on this side, bolt everything together, and repeat the process on the other side. But that's not all I need to do in order to make this thing work. I want to actually put some paste wax on the insides of the sled and on the actual wood for the shuttle that's going to move back and forth. This will just make everything slide a lot nicer and be a little bit easier in the end to use. And the fit is almost perfect. It's easy enough to move by my hand, but it won't necessarily move by itself. There's a little bit of resistance in the middle, but I'm sure as I use it, it'll come out. And now it's time to finish the shuttle. It's dead simple for this. All you need to do is mark out the holes of where the router is gonna go, and I just took off the plunge base from my router and put it on there, and then mark out the holes for where the dust collection port's gonna go. Do not skip the dust collection port. This thing generates so much sawdust, you're gonna wanna suck up as much of that at the source as you can. Now with the holes marked out, I just use a 2.5 inch hole saw to drill the big holes. Then I'm going to come back later and use threaded inserts for the small holes on the plunge base. This is going to quickly let me attach and detach the plunge base in case I want to use it for other projects without having to continuously screw or unscrew directly from the wood. This just makes everything last a lot longer because you can only screw it to plywood so many times before it won't hold anymore. For the dust collection port, I am, however, just going to screw directly into it because that's never going to come off. And a little trick when you're cutting these holes with the hole saw is you go in halfway on one side, halfway on the other side, and that way you have perfectly round holes with no tear out. Okay, now it's actually time to put in the threaded inserts. First, I'm just going to drill the holes where I marked before using a stop on my drill bit. It's really important to keep these things straight up and down. I didn't quite get it straight up and down, but I got it close enough. And another really important thing you have to do when you're doing threaded inserts is you have to use like a chamfering bit to put a little bevel on the insides of these holes. This will just help the threaded insert sit below, not on top of the wood, and that way the router base would sit completely flush against it. And so I bought this little thing that you're seeing me use to make these little chamfers just for this purpose, although it is a great tool for other projects. And then I just use these umbrella screw bits with a hex, I don't know what you call it, the hex hole at the very top, and I screwed them in. It worked perfectly, and this will let me assemble and deassemble this whenever I need to pull out this base for another project. And if you guys like this content or you're getting ideas for your shop, then please consider subscribing. It really helps out with the YouTube algorithm and helps grow the channel. Okay, you're probably wondering at this point, well, now you have two pieces of angle iron that are bolted together, but you still need to raise them up over the wood in order to actually plane it down. If I'm flattening a slab that's, about 1.5 inches thick, 2-inch legs seems to be perfectly fine for that because I'm using a plunge base, and the plunge base can go down about 1 inch. So gives it a little play, but honestly, if I need to raise it up, I can just cut longer ones. It won't take that long. And I already had a hole through my angle iron where I could attach these. You're probably actually gonna have to drill another hole there in order to do this. And then what you do is just drill it straight through the end cap plywood into your legs, but drill a pilot hole through the top plywood. That way you're not continuously screwing in and out of it. You're just going through a hole.
All right, the router sled's all built. I set up a test piece that we can test it on, just a bunch of 2x4s I glued up that need flattening. And I secured everything to the bench. Essentially how this works is the router sled, of course, moves this way, back and forth, and then I just have these little feet here that I just screw in just to, keep everything above the workpiece. Now, this is all predicated on the fact that I have a very flat, square, level top to my table, and if you didn't have that, this wouldn't work because you'd have to have something square to reference to. But since I have it, it's good enough just to slide back and forth. And the other really big benefit to this router sled is it's super compact. Like I've seen other setups where they have like a full 4x8 table just for their router sled with like linear rails, whatever, and those were great. But if you've got a small shop like me, yeah, you don't have space to have a giant one. So this will pretty much do everything I want. And now we're gonna test it to see if it's actually flat.
And this is kind of where the magic happens. All I do is I put the router sled just directly on my work table. You have to make sure your workbench, your work table is completely flat because you're indexing directly on it with those legs and you're just kind of sliding it back and forth. But honestly, it just saves so much space. Like you don't need the X-axis linear rails, you only need the Y-axis in this case. And you just move it back and forth, sliding it down. And I'll show you the results at the end of this video. It honestly worked pretty good. And this is the real speed that I was going at. I've seen YouTube videos where people just kind of fly back and forth, but honestly, you're going pretty slow when you're doing this. It does beat having to either take your slab to a shop where you have to pay them money, probably a lot of money, in order to flatten these things, because you have to load up, you have to drive there, do it, drive back, unload. That's probably gonna be a couple hours. I feel like even as slow as these router sleds are, they're probably still faster than that. Like I go through this little thing in about, 10 minutes. If I were to do say like a 72-inch by 40-inch, which is kind of the table size that I usually build, it may take an hour total, maybe an hour and a half, but at least I don't have to actually do all that work of going and driving a place. And here you see me just going back and forth on the Y-axis and just literally sliding it down on the X-axis. That dust collection port cuts down tremendously on the dust, but there's still quite a bit that actually spews out. I actually kind of thought that I could put those brushes that you see on other CNC machines on the sides, and that might be a future improvement I do. And I want to know your thoughts on this router sled. Let me know in the comments if you think this is a good idea.
Okay, before I sand this, because I want to get it perfectly flat, I just want to show you what this jig, this really simple jig, actually was able to do. So you have a little bit of the milling marks, but that's the purpose of sanding. So yeah, it's like almost perfectly flat. And these are just 2x4s I just glued up. There's a little bit of a gouge there just because the edge of the wood was ripped because it's crappy wood. But let's sand it out, let's see how smooth we can get it. All right, it's all done, check this out. So I sanded up to 220 and it's perfectly flat, perfectly smooth. Like you can't see any imperfections in that. And if we flip it over, I obviously didn't mill this side, but we can do like the wobble test. I don't know what they call it. Like, move you guys over there if you guys can see. So it's perfectly flat. If I push on any of these two corners at the diagonal, it shouldn't wobble. Look at that. It's probably cost me $100 to build. $100 in materials, mostly the angle iron, which I got from Home Depot. And if you guys wanted to do a lot cheaper, you probably could find a metal supplier that would provide that for like a quarter of the cost you can get at Home Depot. And obviously, you know, not including the router. This router was like 250 bucks, the base and the actual router itself all together, yeah. And this probably took me 2 hours. They're about 2 hours to build. So very useful. I'm gonna be using this a lot in the future for flattening tables. I'm a little worried it might be too small, but whatever. I can make a larger one. It doesn't take that long if I need to. But for now, it should be good. I think I might have to like add, like I see on the CNC machines, they have like these little like brush things on the side here that like keeps all the dust in there. So your dust collection can grab it all. I might need to add that because this thing produces a ton, and I mean a ton of dust, but it is pretty good so far. And I actually tried this without this dust collection port on one of my previous builds. And yeah, my entire garage was completely filled, and this time it wasn't, so. Yeah, overall, very happy with it. And if you guys have stuck around to the very end of this video, then please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. See you guys in the next one.